Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a deep dive into one of history's most bizarre and mysterious events, the Dancing Plague of 1518. Picture this. It's the summer of 1518, and the streets of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, are filled with a strange spectacle. People, hundreds of them, are dancing wildly in the streets, not out of joy, but seemingly out of uncontrollable force. Now, you're probably thinking, dancing? That sounds like fun. But let me assure you, you wouldn't have enjoyed this one bit. These weren't joyful, coordinated dances. This was madness. And here's the kicker. No one knows exactly why it happened. Before we get into the specifics, let me drop a little truth bomb. You probably won't survive this. Not because the story's dangerous, of course, but because, well, it's about to get so wild your brain might need a nap by the end. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, post your location and the time in your part of the world. I'm curious where you're all tuning in from tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine the scene. The year is 1518. You're walking through the streets of Strasbourg, which, to be honest, is already a little chaotic. The air is thick with the usual mix of smells, sweat, horses, and perhaps the faint, ever-present scent of disease when you see it. At first, you think it's just a few people goofing off, maybe some street performers doing their thing. But no, it's much worse than that. You spot a woman, her eyes wide, a frantic look on her face, as she twists and jerks uncontrollably, her body moving to an invisible beat. You think maybe she's having some sort of seizure or convulsion. But then you look around and see another person, then another and another. Soon it's not just one woman. It's a whole crowd of people, some dancing, others clearly in distress, but all of them caught in the same inexplicable movement. Strasbourg's streets have become a stage for one of the most bizarre episodes in history. No one knows what's happening or why it's happening, but more and more people seem to be joining in. It's as if the city itself has been infected by some kind of uncontrollable urge to dance. Now you might be thinking, okay, but how bad could it really get? Well, buckle up, because this dance party goes from strange to downright terrifying in a matter of weeks. The first known case was a woman named Frau Trophäa. One day, for reasons no one could quite figure out, she started dancing. It wasn't a fun, carefree little jig. Oh no, this was a full-on, frantic, involuntary movement that left her struggling to stop. She danced for hours, days even, and soon she wasn't alone. Other people joined her, and it quickly became clear that this wasn't some spontaneous show of joy. This was something more disturbing. By the end of the first week, nearly 30 people were dancing uncontrollably. By the second week, the number had swelled to over 100. It was an epidemic, a contagious madness that no one could stop. The authorities were stumped. What could they do to stop this chaotic collective madness? The town council, desperate for answers, consulted the local physicians, and the advice they got, well, it was certainly interesting. The doctors, who had their own theories on the matter, concluded that the dancers must be suffering from a form of hot blood, a condition where the body's humours were imbalanced, causing the dancers to lose control. To fix this, the physicians recommended more dancing. That's right. In an effort to cure the dancers, the authorities hired professional dancers to keep the affected people dancing. This was no longer a case of people dancing for fun or as a form of entertainment. Now, it was an attempt to treat the condition by encouraging the afflicted to keep dancing until the illness was burned out of them. Historians still argue over whether this treatment was effective, but I can't help but wonder if this whole situation was just a tragic, confused mess. Imagine being one of the dancers, knowing something was wrong but not being able to stop. Imagine being in the crowd, watching people you knew dance to their deaths, or at least to a state of complete exhaustion. Yeah, I know it's hard to picture, but trust me, things got really weird, really quickly. This is where the story starts to get especially odd. You see, as more and more people fell victim to the dancing, the city's response grew even more frantic. At one point, the authorities even considered bringing in religious figures. Priests, monks and clergy were called upon to help cure the madness. Some believed the dance was a form of divine punishment, that the city had angered God, and this was a way for him to teach them a lesson. Others thought it was a possession, a sign that the dancers had been taken over by evil spirits. But for all their attempts, the dancing didn't stop. It was as if no one had any answers, and the whole thing spiraled out of control. Now, let's take a step back here. Before we dive deeper into the theories about what caused the dancing plague, it's important to remember that this wasn't just a small event in a forgotten town. No, this was something that left a lasting mark on history. Imagine how many people must have witnessed it. Not just the ones who were dancing, but the people who watched in horror. Can you picture the scenes? The confused onlookers, the terrified family members, and the officials who were desperately trying to put a stop to it all. But let's not forget, there was something particularly unnerving about the whole thing. Not just the sight of people dancing uncontrollably, but the fact that this was happening in a city that had already been ravaged by the plague. People in Strasbourg were no strangers to death. They had seen their fair share of suffering, but this was something entirely different. Something that no one could explain. Historians, doctors and researchers still scratch their heads when they try to figure out what triggered the outbreak. Was it mass hysteria? Was it some kind of psychological phenomenon where the stress of living in a city beset by plague and disease led people to lose control of their minds and bodies? Or was there a more physical cause, like a toxin or disease that affected the brain? Well, we'll get to that in a bit. But for now, let's just pause and take a moment to really appreciate how strange and frightening this all must have been. After all, these dancers didn't just dance for a few minutes, they danced for hours, days, even weeks. And it wasn't a joyous celebration. It was a desperate, uncontrollable movement that claimed lives, and in some cases ruined families. So imagine yourself as a resident of Strasbourg watching this unfold in your own city. The streets are chaotic, the air is filled with confusion, fear, and a sense of doom. And the one thing you want, your answer, your explanation, is nowhere to be found. It's almost like you're in a nightmare, watching something unravel that you can't understand, something that seems almost too ridiculous to be real. But it was real. It was happening. And that, my friends, is where this strange and unsettling journey into the past begins. So you've just witnessed this chaotic dancing epidemic sweep through Strasbourg, and now you're probably asking yourself, what was going on? Was this some sort of ancient flash mob or just mass madness? Let me assure you this was no party, and it wasn't coordinated by anyone trying to throw a good time. This was something far darker, and the implications were far more disturbing. But before we dive deeper into the possible causes of the dancing plague, let's take a closer look at who these dancers were and what exactly they were going through. You can't help but imagine the scene. People of all ages, men, women, and even children, spinning and jerking uncontrollably in the streets. The sound of their frenzied movements would have echoed through the cobbled streets, drowning out the usual sounds of daily life. Strangers, once innocent bystanders, would have suddenly found themselves caught in the wild dance. Their bodies would have a mind of their own, as though some invisible force had taken control. Some would have danced until they collapsed from exhaustion, and others, tragically, would have danced until they died from sheer physical stress. The most famous of these dancers, Frau Trophäa, was the woman who started it all. She was the first to fall victim to the plague, stepping out into the street in a trance-like state and beginning to dance. At first, people probably thought it was a fluke. Maybe she was just having a little moment of strange behaviour, but as the days passed, more and more people joined her, and the dance spread through the city like wildfire. It wasn't long before a wave of people, more than 100 at first and eventually hundreds more, had succumbed to the same compulsion. One might wonder, how did it all start? Frau Trophäa, like the other dancers, wasn't alone in her suffering. You see, once she began to dance, Others became infected with the same uncontrollable need to move. There were whispers around town that perhaps the curse was contagious, both in body and in mind. Could it have spread like a viral infection? Was it so powerful that once a person saw someone else moving, their own body would take over, forcing them to join in? This is where things start to get really puzzling. It's said that the dancing wasn't just random either. No, these people weren't out there doing the cha-cha or the moonwalk. No, this was wild, frenetic, exhausting movement that often involved spinning in circles, flailing limbs, and even convulsing. It wasn't rhythmic, it wasn't graceful, it was chaotic and horrifying to witness. Imagine being a family member, watching your loved one go into a trance and simply unable to stop. Imagine your own body taking over, no longer under your control, while you look around and see others experiencing the same thing. At the height of the epidemic, the authorities were at a loss. Imagine how terrifying it must have been for the people of Strasbourg to see their city in such chaos. People who didn't know each other were suddenly united in a strange collective force that no one could explain. It was as though the laws of nature had been flipped upside down and no one had a clue how to stop it. Historians still argue whether this was a form of mass hysteria or if something physical, like a disease or a toxin, was at the root of this strange behaviour. But even today, we don't have a definitive answer. Historians, doctors and other experts have spent centuries attempting to dissect what happened during the summer of 1518. Was it the result of a psychological breakdown, a collective trauma triggered by the stress of living through the plague and other hardships? Some believe that the people of Strasbourg were so burdened by fear and grief from the death and suffering around them that their minds cracked, causing them to hallucinate or experience a form of collective delusion. Imagine being surrounded by death and disease day after day. How would that affect your mental state? Would it push you over the edge into madness? For some, it may have. But was it simply psychological? Some believe that the answer lies in something more tangible. What if the outbreak was the result of an environmental factor, like a contaminant or poison that spread throughout the town? And we're not talking about just any old poison. Some have suggested that the dancers may have been poisoned by ergot, a hallucinogenic fungus that grows on rye. Ergot is known for causing symptoms like muscle spasms, hallucinations, and, in extreme cases, death. If the people of Strasbourg unknowingly consumed bread or other foods made from contaminated rye, they could have experienced the same bizarre symptoms that led them to dance uncontrollably. But, and this is where things get interesting, there's a serious problem with this theory. If ergot poisoning were truly the cause, why did it only affect certain people? Why did others, even in the same city, remain unaffected? And why did the outbreak seem to spread so quickly? If ergot poisoning were the cause, wouldn't everyone in the city have been affected at the same time? This is where the theory becomes a little shaky, and scholars are left questioning whether ergot was indeed the cause, or whether it was a perfect storm of social, psychological and environmental factors that led to the dancing plague. What's even more strange is that once this phenomenon began, there seemed to be no stopping it. Despite efforts to stop the dancers, it just went on and on. Imagine being stuck in a trance for days, unable to rest, unable to stop, and unable to understand why your body is acting like this. The city by now had no idea what to do. They tried everything they could think of, but nothing worked. Some authorities tried to hold public meetings with religious leaders and ask for divine intervention, while others consulted doctors who were at a loss as to what was happening. But no solution came. Some sources even claim that the authorities considered extreme measures. In one desperate attempt to end the madness, the officials in Strasbourg brought in professional dancers and musicians to encourage the afflicted to keep dancing. Why? They believed that the only way to stop the plague was to let the affected dancers keep moving, almost like a form of purging the sickness from their bodies. But this only made things worse. More and more people joined in, and the dancers only became more exhausted, more frantic, and closer to collapse. So here's the real kicker. You might think, okay, maybe it's a psychological breakdown, but then, what caused the dancers to finally stop? after weeks of this bizarre epidemic, the dancing simply came to an end. There was no cure, no clear explanation, just an abrupt stop. It's like a switch flipped. One minute the streets were filled with the wild, uncontrollable dancing, and the next it was over. But why? Historians still debate the cause of the sudden cessation. Did the body simply wear itself out? Were the dancers so exhausted that their bodies finally gave up? Or was it something else that caused the madness to finally end? We may never know. Now, if we step back and look at the bigger picture, we have to ask, what does this say about the people of Strasbourg and their collective experience? They had lived through so much turmoil, plague, famine, political strife, that the mental and emotional toll may have finally broken their spirits. The dancing, in a way, was the ultimate release of all that pent-up frustration and despair. Could this have been a form of collective grief? Some psychologists argue that the dancers' movements were an expression of the extreme trauma they had been experiencing. It's an interesting theory, and one that we may never truly know the answer to. But the questions remain. Why did it happen? Why was Strasbourg in particular so susceptible to this strange and terrifying epidemic? Was it psychological? Was it environmental? Was it both? The answers are as elusive as the dancers themselves. So, as you settle into tonight's journey, take a moment to think about this bizarre episode in history. It's hard to imagine that something as strange as the dancing plague of 1518 could really have happened, but history is full of oddities like this. And as we continue our story, we'll explore more about the theories, the chaos, and the strange aftermath that left Strasbourg wondering what had just occurred. Now let's take a step back and really think about what it was like in Strasbourg during the height of this wild and uncontrollable epidemic. Picture the streets again, filled with the maddened, twisting bodies of the dancers. The sound of their frantic steps echoed in the air as if the city itself had been taken over by an unexplainable force. Can you feel the tension in the air? It's not just the dancers, though. No, the whole city is in turmoil, unsure of what is happening and, more importantly, how to stop it. As we dig deeper into the events, we have to ask, how did the authorities respond? Well, their initial reaction was, predictably, one of confusion. The mayor, the city's officials, and the clergy were all at a loss. Imagine being in charge of a town and suddenly hundreds of your citizens are dancing uncontrollably in the streets. Not only does this affect the local economy, with traders and workers distracted, but it also spreads panic. How do you calm a city when your own citizens are moving to some invisible rhythm that no one can stop? The local authorities were desperate, and it was clear they needed help. But where would that help come from? The first thing the authorities did was consult the town's physicians. The response from the medical community? Well, let's just say it wasn't what you might expect. The doctors were not exactly in tune with what was happening. In fact, their diagnosis was truly baffling. They believed the dancers were suffering from hot blood. This condition, according to their theory, was caused by an imbalance in the humours of the body. In simpler terms, they thought that too much heat had built up inside the dancers' bodies, leading them to lose control. It's a bit laughable now, considering how outdated medical practices were back then, but it's also easy to see how this explanation must have seemed plausible to the people of Strasbourg at the time. But what's even stranger than the diagnosis is the solution the doctors came up with. Hold on to your hat for this one. They recommended that the afflicted dancers keep dancing. That's right. They believed that the only way to cure the hot blood was to let the dancers continue moving. So in a move that can only be described as desperate, the city officials hired professional dancers and musicians to encourage the afflicted people to keep dancing. It's like they thought that if the dancers just danced enough, they would eventually burn off the excess heat in their bodies and be cured. Sounds ridiculous, right? Well, it was, but there's one thing we can't deny. It was a reflection of just how confused and frantic everyone was. No one had any idea what was going on, and no one knew what to do. But despite this rather bizarre attempt to cure the dancers, things only escalated. More people joined in. The more the authorities tried to manage the situation, the worse it became. Within weeks, the number of dancers had risen to over 400 people, and this was no small feat. The epidemic was spreading, not just across the city, but across the population, with people from all walks of life succumbing to the strange compulsion. Imagine being a family member watching your loved one slip into this dance, unable to stop, their body jerking and twisting against their will. How terrifying must it have been to watch someone you care about move like this and know you couldn't do anything about it? One of the most disturbing aspects of this whole situation was the toll the dancing was taking on the dancers themselves. Many danced until they were physically exhausted, some even to the point of collapse. Some collapsed from sheer exhaustion, while others reportedly died from the extreme physical stress. It wasn't just tiring, it was dangerous. The physical toll was immense, and yet the dancers couldn't stop. Can you imagine being trapped in your own body, unable to stop moving, unable to take a breath, unable to rest? It sounds like something out of a nightmare, but it was very real for the people of Strasbourg. There were reports that several dancers even collapsed from heart failure, with some victims dying in the streets from exhaustion. What's even more tragic is the fact that, at this time, no one really understood what was happening. They didn't have the scientific knowledge that we have today. They didn't know about neurological disorders, mental health conditions, or the kinds of illnesses that could cause such strange behaviour. Instead, they resorted to the only explanations they knew: divine punishment or medical conditions like hot blood. The city officials, in their desperation, turned to religion, calling upon priests and monks to perform exorcisms, prayers and rituals to rid the city of whatever curse had fallen upon it. The people believed they were being punished by God for their sins, and that only religious intervention could save them. Historians still argue whether this was simply mass hysteria, an outbreak of psychological contagion, or if something physical, like a drug or toxin, was responsible. It's a question that continues to fascinate researchers today. Could it have been a psychological event triggered by the extreme stress of the times? Remember, Strasbourg was no stranger to suffering, with the Black Death still fresh in people's memories. The people were living in a constant state of fear, uncertainty and grief, which could have created the right conditions for a psychological breakdown. But was it really just stress and fear, or was something else at play? Some scholars believe the answer lies in the mysterious fungus called ergot, which grows on rye and produces hallucinogenic effects when consumed. Ergot poisoning, or St. Anthony's fire, is known to cause symptoms like hallucination, spasms and convulsions. Could the people of Strasbourg have unknowingly consumed bread made from contaminated rye, and could that have led to the outbreak? It's a compelling theory, especially considering the fact that the symptoms described by those who witnessed the dancing epidemic resemble those of ergot poisoning. But here's the problem. Not everyone who lived in Strasbourg during the epidemic ate the contaminated bread, and not everyone who did became affected. So, is ergot the real cause, or could it be something else entirely? As you begin to think about these theories, it's clear that we may never have a definitive answer. The dancing plague of 1518 remains one of history's great mysteries, and no theory has been able to fully explain what happened. But one thing is for certain: it was a traumatic event for the people of Strasbourg, and it left an indelible mark on the city's history. Imagine living through that, seeing your loved ones dance themselves to death, and knowing that no one could help. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? But let's not dwell too long in the past. Instead, let's consider the lasting impact of this strange epidemic. Historians still look back at the dancing plague as one of the most curious and inexplicable events in European history. It raises questions about the nature of mass hysteria, the limits of medical knowledge at the time, and the power of collective psychology. Even today, when people speak of mass hysteria, they often refer to this event as one of the first recorded instances of such a phenomenon. But the real question remains: will we ever truly understand what happened in Strasbourg during that fateful summer? We may never know for sure, but as we continue to unravel the layers of this strange event, we can be sure of one thing. The dancing plague will continue to fascinate and perplex us for years to come. As we move forward in our exploration of the dancing plague of 1518, let's take a moment to reflect on the broader implications of this extraordinary event. The epidemic didn't just shake the people of Strasbourg, it reverberated throughout the world and left behind questions that would haunt historians for centuries. Imagine witnessing an event like that. The streets filled with people dancing, their movements growing more erratic by the minute, some dancing to their deaths, while others were caught in the same maddening rhythm without a clue as to why. You might be thinking, how could something so bizarre happen in a town like Strasbourg, and how did it come to an end? Well, we're about to dive deeper into the theories that try to explain this unprecedented phenomenon. While many modern observers might dismiss the dancing epidemic as some sort of strange fluke, it's important to remember that the event had a lasting impact on how people viewed both physical and psychological health. At the time, there was little understanding of mental illnesses, neurological disorders, or the role that environmental factors could play in causing collective behaviour. All people had to go on with their beliefs and religious explanations. For many, the idea that the dancers were cursed, or that they had somehow angered God, was the only explanation that made sense. In a way, this reflects the medieval worldview, a time when unexplained events were often attributed to supernatural causes. But let's take a closer look at how this mass hysteria might have spread. Some historians believe that the idea of contagion was key to the event. No, not a virus, but a psychological contagion. Just as laughter or yawning can be contagious, so too could be a psychological state of distress. This phenomenon, where one person's actions or emotions can trigger a similar reaction in others, is known as mass hysteria. Once a few people began dancing uncontrollably, others may have been influenced to join in, even if they initially had no desire to do so. It's a fascinating concept, and one that speaks to the power of the mind over the body. Now let's consider how the authorities handled the situation. At first they were baffled, as you might expect. People who were once perfectly fine were suddenly overcome with the compulsion to dance, and no one knew what to do. The local physicians, in their infinite wisdom, decided that the best course of action was to let the dancing continue. They believed the dancers were suffering from an imbalance in their humours, a theory that was commonly held at the time. According to this view, the dancers' bodies were too hot, and dancing was thought to be a way to release the excess heat. So, in a strange twist of logic, the authorities hired musicians and professional dancers to encourage the afflicted to keep moving. If that sounds insane to you, you're not alone. Even for medieval times, this was a pretty desperate and misguided solution. But let's pause here for a moment and think about what might have happened if the authorities had taken a different approach. What if they had treated the incident as a medical emergency and sought to find a physical cause, like a poisoning, or tried to offer the dancers some kind of treatment to help them regain control? What if the city had called in a team of medical professionals to examine the situation? Perhaps they could have identified a more logical cause, like ergot poisoning, which we'll talk about in a bit. But instead, the authorities chose to embrace the mystical and religious explanations that were the norm at the time. Could things have been different if they had been more open-minded? It's a question that historians continue to wrestle with today. Speaking of ergot poisoning, let's dive into one of the most compelling theories behind the cause of the dancing plague. As we've mentioned earlier, ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and can cause hallucinations, muscle spasms, and even death when consumed. In modern times, we know about the toxic effects of ergot and how it can affect the body, but in the 16th century, people had no such knowledge. The theory goes that if the people of Strasbourg had been eating bread made from rye contaminated with ergot, they might have experienced the same symptoms that the dancers exhibited. This theory is particularly compelling because some of the symptoms described by witnesses, hallucinations, muscle spasms, and even seizures, are consistent with the effects of ergot poisoning. But here's the catch. While it's certainly possible that ergot poisoning could have been the cause of the dancing plague, there are a few issues with this theory. For one, not everyone in Strasbourg was affected by the dancing. If the cause was ergot poisoning, It would stand to reason that everyone who ate the contaminated bread would have been affected, right? But that wasn't the case. Only certain people were struck by the strange compulsion to dance, and others, even in the same city, remained unaffected. This discrepancy raises questions about whether ergot poisoning could truly explain what happened in Strasbourg. Could there have been something else at play here? Something that we still don't fully understand? In addition to ergot poisoning, some researchers believe that the dancing plague could have been caused by a combination of psychological stress, social pressure, and mass hysteria. After all, Strasbourg was a city that had already been devastated by the Black Death, and the people were living in a constant state of fear and uncertainty. Imagine the pressure of trying to survive during a time when disease, famine, and political instability were commonplace. Could the collective stress have caused the people of Strasbourg to lose control of their minds and bodies? Some psychologists argue that this kind of collective breakdown is not only possible, but likely under the circumstances. The fact that mass hysteria has been observed in other instances throughout history suggests that the mind can sometimes become overwhelmed by stress, trauma, and fear, leading to irrational behaviours. The idea that the dancing was triggered by psychological factors rather than a physical cause is a compelling one. It's also worth noting that similar outbreaks of mass hysteria have been recorded throughout history. In the 16th century, for example, there were reports of people in other parts of Europe experiencing similar episodes of uncontrollable behaviour. Could it be that the dancing plague of 1518 was just one example of a much larger pattern of mass psychological breakdowns? As we continue to explore this strange event, we can't ignore the role that religion played in how the people of Strasbourg responded to the crisis. Religious explanations were deeply ingrained in the medieval mindset, and many people believed that the dancing was a form of divine punishment. It's not surprising, then, that the clergy and religious authorities were called in to intervene. The idea that the plague was a punishment from God would have been a powerful force in a society where religion was central to daily life. But could the religious explanations have been a way to make sense of something that, at the time, had no rational explanation? Could they have provided comfort to the people, even as they were trapped in the madness of the dancing? These are questions that historians and theologians have pondered for centuries. Now, let's take a moment to consider how this event shapes the future. While the immediate effects of the dancing plague were tragic, its long-term impact was profound. The epidemic left behind a legacy that still resonates today. Theories about mass hysteria, psychological contagion, and ergot poisoning continue to inform our understanding of similar phenomena in modern times. In many ways, the dancing plague of 1518 serves as a reminder of how little we truly understand about the human mind and body, and how easily it can be pushed to its limits. But perhaps the most lasting impact of this event is the way it forced people to question the limits of human knowledge. At the time, medical science was still in its infancy, and people relied on superstition and religious beliefs to explain the unexplainable. The dancing plague, however, forced people to confront the fact that there were mysteries in the world that couldn't be explained away by religion or superstition. And in doing so, it set the stage for a new era of scientific inquiry, a time when people would begin to question the status quo and seek out more rational, evidence-based explanations for the world around them. It's clear that the dancing plague of 1518 was not just a strange historical anomaly, it was a turning point. It challenged the way people thought about health, disease, and the power of the human mind. And though the plague itself eventually came to an end, its influence continues to shape our understanding of mass behaviour and psychological phenomena to this day. As we wrap up this section, take a moment to think about how this event resonates with us in the present. The dancing plague of 1518 may seem like a distant and bizarre episode in history, but its themes are timeless. Whether it's the influence of social pressures, the role of psychological stress, or the power of collective behaviour, we can still see echoes of the dancing plague in the world around us today. It's a haunting reminder that no matter how much we think we know, there are still mysteries in the world that we may never fully understand. As we continue this strange journey into the heart of the dancing plague, we can't help but notice that, although it occurred more than 500 years ago, it still resonates in modern times. It's easy to dismiss this bizarre event as something from the distant past, something that has no real relevance today. But when you look at how this event unfolded and how people responded, you start to realise that, in many ways, the dancing plague reflects a deeper truth about human nature, about our capacity for collective behaviour, the influence of societal stress, and how we cope with trauma. By now, you've probably begun to realise just how much this event in Strasbourg was about more than just strange dancing. It wasn't just about people losing control of their bodies. It was about a city, perhaps even a whole society, being on the edge of something much larger. Imagine the toll the plague, famine, political instability and disease had already taken on these people. Life was fragile in the 16th century, and for the residents of Strasbourg, the dancing plague was merely the final breaking point. It wasn't just the physical toll of dancing, it was the emotional, psychological and spiritual pressure that pushed these people into an extreme response. But let's dive deeper into the psychological side of things, because it's crucial to understanding what could have caused this mass outbreak of behaviour. Think about how people in the modern world can be influenced by societal stress, collective fear, or traumatic events. We've seen modern examples of mass hysteria, where a group of people, driven by panic or fear, exhibit irrational behaviours. These events often have psychological triggers similar to what might have been at play in Strasbourg. In the 16th century, though, there was no understanding of mental health, no recognition of mass psychological phenomena like we have today. People back then, just as now, would have been influenced by what was happening around them, and the stress, fear and trauma of living through the plague, wars and death created the perfect environment for this collective breakdown. The modern world might not see outbreaks of dancing mania like those in medieval Europe, but mass psychological events are still seen today in various forms. From the panic buying during a natural disaster, to the way social media can make people feel an emotional connection to global events, we're still susceptible to collective behaviours that can spiral out of control. The dancing plague serves as a reminder that our minds and bodies are vulnerable to powerful forces, especially when we're under extreme stress or uncertainty. This raises an important question. Could the same thing happen today? Could there be a modern-day dancing plague, or something similar, brought on by societal pressures, collective fear, or psychological trauma? Some may argue that modern medicine, understanding of mental health and societal progress have made such events unlikely. But just as the people of Strasbourg couldn't have predicted the eruption of this bizarre epidemic, maybe we can't fully predict how modern society might react under certain extreme conditions. The influence of the media, the rise of global crises like climate change, the constant flow of information, and the pressures of modern life could potentially trigger mass psychological events, just as the stress of the medieval era did. It's a sobering thought, one that reminds us that despite our technological advancements, we're still very much driven by our psychology and emotions. We may have learned to cope with individual stresses, but collective stress still has the power to bring people to a breaking point. While this might sound a little unsettling, it also teaches us something valuable. It shows us that we should pay closer attention to how societal stress affects our collective mental health. It's easy to forget how powerful stress and trauma can be, especially when we're caught up in the hustle of modern life. But the dancing plague of 1518 is a reminder that when people are pushed to their limits, strange and inexplicable things can happen. Now let's circle back to some of the theories that have been proposed to explain the epidemic. For example, the fact that not everyone in Strasbourg was affected by the outbreak raises questions about how ergot could have been the sole cause. If ergot poisoning were the trigger, shouldn't it have affected everyone who ate contaminated bread? The answer, as with many historical events, may be more complicated than we can easily explain. Another theory is that the dancing was a form of mass hysteria. Mass hysteria occurs when a group of people experience similar symptoms without any physical cause. In this case, the stress, grief, and fear of living through the constant threat of plague and death may have triggered a psychological breakdown in a group of people. This theory is particularly compelling when you consider how contagious hysteria can be. Just as a few people may have been infected by the dance, others could have joined in simply because they were swept up in the emotional contagion of the moment. Some even argue that the event could have been a cultural expression of trauma. During the late medieval period, people lived in constant fear of death, whether from the plague, famine, or warfare. In some ways, the dancing plague could have been an extreme form of emotional release, a collective expression of the suffering people were enduring. This theory suggests that the people of Strasbourg weren't just dancing for no reason, they were expressing their fear, grief, and trauma in the only way they knew how. It's an intriguing idea, and one that raises important questions about how we express collective pain and suffering in different cultures. As strange as it seems, the dancing plague of 1518 left a lasting legacy. It marked a turning point in how people began to think about mass psychological events. While the epidemic itself may have been forgotten by many over the years, its impact on the collective consciousness cannot be overstated. It shaped how historians, psychologists, and even medical professionals think about the interplay between mind, body, and society. And while we may never fully understand what triggered the dancing plague, it remains a fascinating mystery, one that still raises more questions than answers. One thing is for certain, though. The events of 1518 left a scar on the people of Strasbourg, and the trauma of living through that chaotic summer never truly disappeared. Perhaps that's the most important lesson we can take from the dancing plague. The reminder that in times of great stress, we are all vulnerable to forces beyond our understanding. And in the end, maybe the greatest mystery of all is how we cope with those forces and how our society continues to shape our collective responses to them. As we continue to explore the far-reaching effects of the dancing plague of 1518, let's shift our focus from the immediate events of the epidemic to the aftermath. While the dancers may have ceased their movements after weeks of chaotic behaviour, the lasting impact of the plague wasn't as easily erased. The consequences of this strange and unsettling phenomenon rippled through Strasbourg, through Europe, and even through history. In many ways, the dancing plague marked a dramatic turning point, not just for the people who lived through it, but for how future generations would view the complexities of human behaviour, collective psychology, and societal response to stress. Imagine how the people of Strasbourg must have felt in the aftermath. After the dancers had stopped, after the chaos had quieted down, there must have been an overwhelming sense of confusion and loss. The town had been through a harrowing ordeal. The suddenness with which the event began, the terror it caused, and the strange, inexplicable nature of the entire affair left the people with more questions than answers. And while the dancers may have returned to their normal lives, how could one ever forget the terrifying images of the streets filled with frantic, convulsing bodies? Historians still wonder what the long-term effects were on the collective psyche of Strasbourg's population. If this mass hysteria was rooted in psychological trauma, what lasting impact did it have on the individuals who experienced it, both as dancers and as witnesses? We often forget that mass hysteria, no matter how bizarre or unexplainable it seems to us now, has a real psychological toll. People who are part of such an event may carry with them the scars of that experience for the rest of their lives. For those who danced, the trauma could have led to years of psychological distress, while for the witnesses there may have been feelings of helplessness and fear. But it wasn't just the immediate participants who were affected. The dancing plague left a mark on the community as a whole, a scar on the collective memory of Strasbourg. The event challenged the prevailing worldview of the time, one in which the supernatural and religious explanations were deeply entrenched. When the people of Strasbourg experienced something that was so undeniably real, yet so utterly impossible to explain, it forced them to confront the limits of their understanding. They were left to question the nature of reality itself. Was this the result of divine punishment? Or was it simply a breakdown of the human mind under the pressure of living in such desperate times? These questions didn't have easy answers, and the event left the city and its residents grappling with uncertainty long after the dancing had stopped. One of the most intriguing aspects of the dancing plague's aftermath is the way it shaped future cultural and social responses to collective behaviours. While the specific event itself was singular, it serves as an early example of a larger phenomenon: how societies process extreme stress and trauma. The idea of collective psychological breakdowns, mass hysteria, didn't start with the dancing plague, but it certainly gained more visibility after it. In the centuries following the epidemic, many similar outbreaks of mass hysteria were recorded in various parts of Europe, though none were as extreme as the event in Strasbourg. From these outbreaks, people began to realise that there was something powerful and unpredictable about the human mind, especially when under extreme stress. As modern society progressed, the field of psychology started to develop, and with it, a better understanding of mass psychological phenomena. The idea that a group of people could experience shared delusions or irrational behaviours began to be studied more seriously. The concept of mass hysteria, though not well understood at the time of the dancing plague, became a topic of interest for psychologists and sociologists in later centuries. These experts began to explore the complex ways in which social pressures, fear, and trauma could combine to produce irrational and sometimes dangerous collective behaviours. This is not to say that the causes of mass hysteria were fully understood after the dancing plague. Even today, the mechanisms behind mass psychological events remain elusive. But as researchers continued to study the phenomenon, it became clear that extreme stress, fear, and even the power of suggestion could trigger bizarre behaviours in groups of people. And perhaps, in some small way, the dancing plague of 1518 set the stage for a deeper exploration into the complexities of human psychology. It pushed future generations to question what was possible in the human mind, and to consider that things could go terribly wrong when the human psyche is pushed to its limits. While the event itself may have been forgotten by many in Strasbourg after a few years, it lived on in the stories and folklore of the time. In medieval Europe, strange events like this often became the subject of stories and legends, passed down through generations. These stories, both cautionary and mysterious, served as reminders of the dangers of the unknown and as ways of explaining events that seemed beyond human comprehension. In the case of the dancing plague, the story became a metaphor for the uncontrollable forces of nature and the human mind. It served as a reminder that even in a world of reason and order, there are still things that happen which cannot be easily explained. In modern times, the dancing plague still captures the imagination. It continues to appear in books, documentaries, and even popular culture. It is an event that has become almost mythical, a strange moment in history that defies logic and understanding. But there is also a very human aspect to it, which is why it continues to resonate with people today. We all, in some way, can relate to the stress and pressures of life, the overwhelming sense of fear and uncertainty that can sometimes feel like too much to bear. The people of Strasbourg in their time were no different. They too faced the horrors of disease, death, and social upheaval. And when they couldn't control the chaos around them, the dancing plague was the result. As we reflect on this extraordinary historical event, we are reminded of how deeply connected we are to our past. The events of 1518, though distant, still have a message for us today. The dancing plague teaches us about the power of collective experience, the fragility of the human mind, and the ways in which trauma can affect not just individuals, but entire communities. It shows us that sometimes, when the world becomes too much to handle, the mind will find ways to cope, whether through dance, delusion, or breakdown. In closing, the dancing plague of 1518 remains one of the most haunting and enigmatic episodes in history. We may never fully understand what caused it, but its impact on our understanding of mass behaviour, psychology, and human resilience is profound. It's a reminder that the line between sanity and madness is thinner than we often realise, and that when society is pushed to its breaking point, the most extraordinary things can happen. The only question left is, how will we, as a society respond the next time we are faced with our own collective crisis? As we reach the later stages of our exploration into the dancing plague of 1518, it's time to take a step back and reflect on the broader cultural and historical ramifications of this peculiar event. While the epidemic itself was contained within the walls of Strasbourg, the ripple effects of the plague reverberated across Europe for years. Its lasting influence stretched far beyond the city, leaving its mark on how societies understood collective behaviour, psychology, and even the nature of disease. When you think about it, the impact of the dancing plague was more than just a matter of public health, or even medieval psychology. It was about human vulnerability in the face of overwhelming stress. This wasn't just a case of people losing their minds in an isolated incident. It was a clear reflection of how societies, particularly those living through tumultuous times, can experience deep psychological and emotional responses to external pressure. And while the event may seem unique to us now, it is far from the only example in history where collective fear, uncertainty, and trauma have manifested in bizarre, sometimes dangerous ways. But before we get into those broader themes, let's take a moment to discuss how the event was recorded and remembered. As strange as it sounds, the dancing plague became an instant subject of curiosity for chroniclers and historians of the time. Reports about the event, though not particularly detailed by modern standards, began to circulate, painting a picture of a people caught in the grip of something beyond their control. Some of the accounts described the dancers as strangers to themselves, as though they were victims of a force that neither they nor anyone else could understand. It's important to note that the way these events were recorded was heavily influenced by the religious and superstitious beliefs of the time. Chroniclers, most of whom were religious scholars or clergy, framed the dancing plague through the lens of divine punishment. After all, if you believe that God controlled all aspects of human life, it would be reasonable to assume that such an inexplicable event had some divine cause. And for many, this was not just an issue of personal health, it was about the state of the soul. The idea that God might be punishing the people of Strasbourg for their sins was one that many took very seriously, leading to the belief that only religious intervention could end the madness. But as we look at the event through a modern lens, the dancing plague becomes a fascinating case study in how we react to unexplained phenomena. In medieval times, when science had yet to make the breakthroughs that would eventually explain the workings of the human body and mind, people often turned to religion or superstition for answers. But even now, centuries later, we're still left with questions about how collective events like this can shape and influence our understanding of health, disease, and human behaviour. It's a question that, despite all our advancements in medicine and psychology, we haven't fully answered. As the centuries passed, the dancing plague gradually faded into the background of history, becoming something of a footnote in the larger narrative of European society. But even as the memory of the event itself began to recede, it left behind questions that were never fully answered. Historians still speculate about the nature of mass hysteria, and the dancing plague of 1518 remains one of the most famous examples of a collective psychological breakdown. Could it be that this episode provided the first real insight into the dangers of societal stress and the human mind's vulnerability to external pressures? It's a fascinating thought, and one that continues to provoke interest. Fast forward to modern times, and you might think that we've outgrown such bizarre phenomena. After all, we have science and technology, and we understand much more about mental health and disease than people in the 16th century could ever have imagined. But the reality is that the human mind is still an incredibly complex and mysterious thing, and while we may have the tools to diagnose and treat mental health disorders, we still don't fully understand why or how mass hysteria can sweep through a group of people in the way it did in Strasbourg. In fact, many modern scholars point to the dancing plague as a precursor to other mass psychological events. These might not involve dancing, but they involve collective behaviour that, at first glance, seems irrational or bizarre. From political movements to social phenomena like moral panics, we've seen how entire societies can be influenced by fear, stress, and uncertainty. Mass hysteria, collective delusions, and social contagion are still topics of study today. and the dancing plague serves as a chilling reminder of how easy it is for societies to spiral into behaviours that are difficult to understand or explain. So, in a way, the dancing plague is not just an isolated incident from the distant past. It is in many ways a precursor to a more modern understanding of collective psychological events. Whether it's a group of people engaging in an inexplicable ritual or an entire society responding to a shared fear, the psychological mechanisms behind these behaviours are eerily similar to what we witnessed in Strasbourg in 1518. And as modern societies continue to face increasing levels of stress, uncertainty and global crises, it's worth asking whether we are truly immune to the kind of collective breakdown that happened all those centuries ago. Interestingly, some researchers have even compared the dancing plague to more recent instances of social phenomena that have swept through modern populations. Take, for example, the fads, or trends, that can spread rapidly in the digital age, whether it's a viral dance challenge on TikTok or a sudden burst of interest in a particular type of music or fashion. While these trends are often light-hearted and fun, they also illustrate how social contagion works in the modern world. It's the same basic principle that may have been at play in Strasbourg all those years ago. When a group of people starts to do something, others are more likely to follow, even if they don't fully understand why. There are even parallels in the way we now see mass emotional reactions to global crises. Think about how people respond to natural disasters, global pandemics, or economic recessions. These events often trigger collective emotional reactions that are not always rational. People panic, they buy excessive amounts of supplies, they react in ways that may not make sense in the larger context, and sometimes they exhibit behaviours that are driven more by fear than by logic. In some cases, entire populations have been known to panic buy during times of uncertainty, just as the dancers in Strasbourg were driven by something beyond their control. So, while it might seem like the dancing plague was just a strange anomaly from the distant past, it actually holds up a mirror to many of the behaviours we still see today. It's a reminder that human nature hasn't changed all that much over the centuries. We may live in a world full of technology, science and modern medicine, but we're still deeply influenced by our emotions, our fears, and the social pressures that surround us. The dancing plague serves as both a historical enigma and a timely lesson in understanding how societies respond to collective trauma. As we bring our journey through the dancing plague to a close, let's take one final moment to reflect on what we've learned. The epidemic may have been an extreme case, but it provides valuable insights into human behaviour, societal stress, and the mind's vulnerability to external pressures. It serves as a warning. No matter how advanced we think we are, the human mind remains as mysterious and unpredictable as ever. And, in times of great distress, who knows what strange phenomena we might encounter next? As we move through the final stretch of our journey into the dancing plague of 1518, it's essential to consider what we can take away from this strange event. Sure, it happened more than 500 years ago, and it may seem like a bizarre historical anomaly that doesn't have much relevance to modern life. But as we delve deeper into the psychological, social and cultural ramifications of the dancing plague, we begin to realise that this event was not only a reflection of the time in which it occurred, but also a mirror for our contemporary world. It sheds light on how stress, trauma and collective anxiety can push people into irrational behaviours, and how, when faced with the unknown, societies can often react in ways that seem just as mystifying as the events themselves. Let's pause for a moment and reflect on how Strasbourg must have felt in the aftermath of the epidemic. The dancers had stopped, but the scars of the event remained. It wasn't just the physical toll that the epidemic had taken on the dancers themselves, but the psychological and emotional toll it had on the entire city. The public in some ways had been traumatised by what they witnessed. It wasn't just the strange spectacle of the dancing, it was the underlying sense of helplessness that accompanied it. The town's officials, physicians and clergy were all stumped, unable to provide any real answers or solutions. Their desperate, misguided attempts to cure the dancers by hiring musicians to encourage more dancing only made the situation worse. In many ways, the event left the city in a state of profound disarray. both psychologically and socially. In reflecting on this, it's worth considering how collective trauma works in general. In modern times, we've seen examples of collective psychological distress manifesting in various forms, whether it's the sudden rise of social movements, mass panic, or even the spread of panic buying during global crises. These modern phenomena can be seen as extensions of the same forces that shaped the dancing plague. The human mind, under extreme stress, can easily break down, and when large numbers of people are exposed to trauma, whether psychological or physical, there's the potential for mass behaviour to spiral into something uncontrollable. The dancing plague serves as a reminder that the human psyche is fragile, and when pushed too far, it can give rise to behaviours that are both bizarre and profoundly unsettling. Of course, in modern society we now have a greater understanding of mental health and psychological conditions. We know, for example, that mass hysteria is a real phenomenon, one that can take hold of groups of people under certain conditions. In the 16th century, however, this understanding was entirely absent. People of that time were far more likely to attribute such strange events to supernatural forces, either divine punishment or demonic possession, because those were the frameworks they had for understanding the world. The physicians who first examined the dancers, for example, were convinced that the cause of the epidemic was a physical ailment, a disorder of the body's humours. They had no concept of mass hysteria, and they were desperate to find a cure, which is why they proposed that the only way to end the plague was for the dancers to continue moving. It's hard to believe that this was considered a solution, but it speaks to the utter lack of understanding of what was happening. But let's look at how far we've come. While mass hysteria is still a topic of interest in the field of psychology, we now know that it's not just about the mind, it's also about the environment. Modern researchers have explored how external stressors, like a history of disease, famine, or social upheaval, can create conditions ripe for collective psychological phenomena. These factors don't just cause individual breakdowns, they can cause entire communities to unravel. Stress, fear, and uncertainty, when shared by a group, can trigger irrational behaviour on a scale that can be shocking to witness. In this sense, the dancing plague of 1518 can be seen as a precursor to the psychological theories we explore today. And what about the historical record itself? The accounts of the dancing plague were written by those who lived through it. They had no understanding of mass hysteria or psychological contagion, so they turned to the language and ideas they knew: divine punishment, supernatural influence, and even demonic possession. This led to a very skewed interpretation of the event. The records from the time focus on the behaviour of the dancers, but they also emphasise the religious and supernatural explanations. In many ways, the dancing plague of 1518 was seen not as a medical or psychological crisis, but as a spiritual one. The town's leaders brought in priests and monks to try to exorcise the evil spirits from the dancers, believing that only through divine intervention could the plague be stopped. In hindsight, we can see how misguided these responses were, but they reflect the limited understanding of the time. And yet, despite these misinterpretations, the event left a lasting impression on how we think about human behaviour, trauma, and group psychology. It served as a warning, even if no one at the time fully realised it, that under certain conditions, whether mental, emotional, or environmental, people can collectively lose control. And in the case of the dancing plague, they did. Now, in the present day, we can look back at the event and ask ourselves, what can we learn from it? The dancing plague teaches us about the fragility of the human mind and the complexities of collective behaviour. It shows us that, even in the absence of an obvious cause, a group of people under the right conditions can act in ways that are profoundly irrational, even dangerous. And it serves as a reminder that when we're faced with collective crises, be they health-related, political or social, our collective behaviour can have unpredictable and far-reaching consequences. But here's the interesting part. While we may never fully understand what triggered the dancing plague, it serves as a fascinating example of how history shapes our understanding of modern issues. The event was not just a strange incident in medieval Europe. It was an early glimpse into the complexities of human psychology. Today, we can look at the dancing plague not just as an oddity, but as a window into the ways that societies cope with trauma, stress, and fear. As we wrap up our journey through the dancing plague, we find that it's not just a tale of people dancing uncontrollably in the streets. It's a reflection of human vulnerability in the face of trauma. It's a reminder that despite all our advances in medicine and technology, we are still deeply influenced by the stress, fear, and social pressures around us. The event of 1518 has become a timeless lesson. When the human mind is pushed too far, anything can happen. We may never know the full truth behind the dancing plague of 1518, but that's part of its enduring mystery. It's a reminder that, even in a world of reason and science, there are still forces at play that we don't fully understand, and that's what makes the dancing plague so powerful. It's not just a historical oddity, but a timeless reflection of the fragile, complex, and sometimes unpredictable nature of the human condition. As we continue to peel back the layers of the dancing plague of 1518, we come to one of the most important reflections this event can offer. It's not just about the odd tragic spectacle of people dancing themselves into exhaustion or even death. The deeper lesson here is about how societies respond to crises, how our minds react under extreme pressure, and how we might one day face similar situations with better tools but still the same frailties. As we bring this story closer to the present day, we must ask ourselves, how much have we really changed, and what can we learn from this moment in history that is still relevant to us today? We've already discussed the psychological impacts of the dancing plague, the mass hysteria, the collective breakdown, the lack of understanding. But when we consider the broader picture, we see that this event was not isolated. It was part of a much larger phenomenon of collective human behaviour in the face of trauma. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last, that a society responded to unbearable stress with irrational, unexplainable actions. Throughout history, we see echoes of this same behaviour. From the Salem witch trials to modern-day moral panics, mass hysteria and collective action in times of crisis are recurring themes. And while the specific details may differ, the psychological mechanisms at play are often the same. Let's explore that idea further. In many ways, the dancing plague is an early example of how a society under extreme duress can unravel. During the 16th century, Europe was ravaged by the Black Death, recurring famines and endless wars. People lived in a constant state of fear. Their lives were precarious, and their faith in the world around them was shaken to the core. It's no surprise that such trauma manifested in the form of mass psychological breakdowns, like the dancing plague. We see similar phenomena today, albeit with different outward expressions. Take, for example, the way modern societies react to global events. We've witnessed collective panic over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, financial crises, and even natural disasters. While the specific behaviours may not include dancing, they do show how societies can react with fear, panic, and sometimes irrational behaviour. People panic, buy goods during emergencies, hoarding supplies in an attempt to regain some semblance of control. Social media amplifies this chaos, spreading fear and misinformation at breakneck speeds. In this way, the psychological underpinnings of the dancing plague can still be seen in modern events. The mind's capacity for collective delusion hasn't changed, it's just expressed in different ways. What the dancing plague can teach us is that, when faced with crisis, the first instinct of many people is to turn inward, to retreat into behaviour that makes sense in the moment, but which in hindsight seems utterly irrational. During the plague, the dancers were simply reacting to the intense pressure they were under. They were victims of their circumstances, influenced by the immense stress and fear surrounding them. They didn't understand why they couldn't stop dancing, just as today's panicked individuals may not fully grasp why they feel compelled to hoard toilet paper or engage in harmful online debates. It's all about the mind's response to chaos. At the same time, the authorities in Strasbourg at the time didn't know how to handle the situation. They had no psychological framework or scientific understanding to address what was happening. In this way, the event highlights a failure of leadership in times of crisis, The authorities weren't equipped to deal with a mass psychological event. Instead, they resorted to religious and pseudo-medical explanations that only exacerbated the situation. This failure is something we still see today. When modern governments face crises like pandemics or economic instability, the response often involves a combination of political infighting, misinformation, and failed attempts to control the situation. Leaders may lack the knowledge or foresight to handle a crisis effectively, which in turn creates confusion and panic. Looking back on the dancing plague through the lens of contemporary psychology, it's clear that collective trauma can have a profound impact on society. In the case of Strasbourg, the city's citizens were already vulnerable. They had been ravaged by the plague and had witnessed death all around them. What happened in 1518 wasn't some random event. It was the eruption of a deeply stressed society, finally breaking under the weight of its fears and losses. And while we now have access to psychological and medical tools that help us better understand and treat mental health conditions, the underlying human experience remains the same. Crisis, trauma, and fear can push people to behave in ways that seem illogical or irrational. And while we may have better coping mechanisms today, we are not immune to mass psychological reactions. The real question is, how can we prevent something like the dancing plague from happening again? How can we mitigate the stress, panic, and fear that are inevitable during times of crisis? The answer, of course, isn't simple. It involves a combination of education, preparation, and community building. Societies must be equipped with the tools and knowledge to understand and address collective psychological phenomena before they spiral out of control. Mental health care must be integrated into disaster response plans, and psychological resilience must be fostered on a societal level. This is an area where modern society can improve, a stark contrast to the Strasbourg of the 16th century, where psychological distress was ignored or misunderstood. Perhaps one of the most lasting legacies of the dancing plague is its reminder that human societies are fragile. When systems of order, understanding, and care break down, we're left to fend for ourselves. Without proper support and leadership, panic and confusion can take root, and what might seem like an isolated event can spiral into a full-scale crisis. Whether it's the plague, an economic collapse, or a global pandemic, history shows us that the human mind can be pushed to the brink when faced with overwhelming stress. And in these moments, the need for strong, compassionate leadership, a deep understanding of psychological well-being, and a society that supports its members cannot be overstated. So, as we reflect on the dancing plague of 1518, we must ask ourselves, what have we learned? Not just from this specific event, but from the broader human experience it represents. The dancing plague was not just a peculiar chapter in history, it was a warning. It was a lesson in the fragility of the human psyche and the importance of addressing collective trauma. It was a reminder that, even in our modern world, we are still deeply affected by the forces of fear, stress, and uncertainty. As we near the end of this journey through the dancing plague of 1518, it becomes clear that the significance of this event transcends the peculiarities of the episode itself. The questions it raises and the lessons it imparts are ones that echo throughout human history. While the plague of dancing may seem like a strange anomaly, its deeper implications about collective behaviour, human vulnerability, and societal response are still as relevant today as they were more than 500 years ago. As we stand in the present, looking back at the bizarre events that unfolded in Strasbourg, we begin to understand that the true legacy of the dancing plague is not found in the details of the dance itself, but in how it forced society to confront the fragility of the human mind and body under extreme stress. At the heart of the dancing plague is a simple yet profound truth. The human mind, when overwhelmed by stress, fear, or trauma, can act in ways that seem illogical, irrational, and even dangerous. The people of Strasbourg in 1518 were not crazy or possessed. They were victims of a societal and psychological breakdown. In their time, with the threat of the plague hanging over them and the constant spectre of death, their minds simply couldn't bear the weight of it all. They sought a release, a way to cope, and this collective act of dancing, though deeply unsettling, became the outlet for their collective anxiety. But how can we apply this lesson to the modern world? If the dancing plague teaches us anything, it is the importance of understanding and addressing the psychological toll that society's stresses can have on individuals and communities. Today, while we have more tools to diagnose and treat mental illness and more access to psychological support, we still face challenges similar to those of the people of Strasbourg. We are living in a world full of uncertainty, whether it's economic instability, political division, or the constant bombardment of information from the digital age. These external pressures create an environment where people are prone to stress, anxiety, and, in extreme cases, mass hysteria. In the face of modern crises, we see similar patterns emerging. Whether it's a global pandemic or the rising tension of climate change, our societies are under immense stress, and the psychological burden is often hidden. Just as the people of Strasbourg lacked the understanding of psychological health in their time, we too struggle to address the mental health challenges that come with the pressures of modern life. While the dancing plague was a physical manifestation of this stress, today's modern forms of mass anxiety can take different shapes: panic buying, social media frenzy, political polarization, and even the spread of misinformation. The common thread, however, is the collective strain we face as a society, and how that strain can manifest in behaviours that seem unexplainable or irrational. But perhaps the most important lesson from the dancing plague is not just about the fragility of the human mind, but about the importance of societal support and leadership. The response of the authorities in Strasbourg, as misguided and desperate as it was, reflects the need for effective crisis management. In the face of something as baffling and uncontrollable as mass hysteria, leadership plays a critical role in providing clarity, calm, and guidance. Unfortunately, the authorities in Strasbourg failed to understand what was happening and instead resorted to the only solutions they knew: religious intervention and pseudo-medical remedies. Their failure to understand the situation only made things worse, and this failure is something that modern societies must learn from. Today, when we face collective crises, we need leaders who can offer calm, rational guidance and who can prioritise mental health support and community resilience. Governments, organisations and individuals must work together to foster environments where psychological well-being is prioritised. This doesn't just mean providing medical care, it also means creating communities where people feel supported, heard and understood. If Strasbourg had better tools to address the collective stress of its population, who knows how things might have turned out differently? The world we live in now may be more advanced in terms of medical knowledge and psychological understanding, but we still face many of the same challenges that plagued Strasbourg in 1518. We're still vulnerable to the pressures of modern life, and just as the people of Strasbourg danced themselves to exhaustion and death, so too might we find ourselves reacting in unpredictable ways to the stresses we face. The key, then, is to build a society that is more resilient in the face of collective anxiety. This means addressing not just the symptoms of stress, but the root causes as well, whether they are social, economic, or political. It's about providing people with the tools they need to cope with the overwhelming pressure of modern life, just as the people of Strasbourg needed better guidance and support during their time of crisis. Another important takeaway from the dancing plague is the role of cultural and societal context in shaping how we respond to stress. The people of 16th century Strasbourg were living in a time of great uncertainty and fear. The threat of the plague, the political instability, and the general sense of unease contributed to a climate where collective breakdowns were more likely. But in today's world, we must ask ourselves, how does our own societal context shape our responses to crises? We live in a world where instant communication, constant news cycles and social media can amplify feelings of stress and anxiety. While this may differ from the world of 1518, the basic human response to crisis remains the same. We must take steps to address these stresses before they lead to collective chaos. Finally, let's return to the question of what we can learn from the dancing plague. It's a tragic and mysterious chapter in history, but its implications reach far beyond the city of Strasbourg. The dancing plague is a reminder that societies are fragile, and human behaviour, when pushed to its limits, can become unpredictable. It is a warning that when we fail to address the collective stress of a society, the consequences can be devastating. It is also a call to action for modern societies to take mental health seriously, to foster supportive communities, and to ensure that, in times of crisis, we don't let fear and panic take control. So as we close the chapter on the dancing plague, we are left with a powerful, albeit eerie lesson, that no matter how advanced we become, the human mind is still as susceptible to stress, fear and collective breakdown as it was centuries ago. And in that vulnerability, we find the power to reflect on how far we've come and how far we still need to go. Let's take this opportunity to create a world where people are supported, understood, and given the tools they need to thrive no matter the crisis. Because as the dancing plague shows us, the road to recovery begins not just with physical cures, but with understanding and compassion for the mind. As we draw closer to the end of our journey into the heart of the dancing plague, let's take a step back and reflect on how such an event, though seemingly a strange and isolated incident from the past, offers valuable lessons that transcend time and geography. In many ways, the dancing plague serves as both a historical curiosity and a deeply insightful lens through which we can understand human behaviour under extreme stress, the role of societal influences, and the limits of our own knowledge. But perhaps the most important thing we can take from this peculiar chapter in history is the profound and enduring mystery it presents about the human condition. The dancing plague of 1518 serves as an example of how human societies, when faced with the unknown, can spiral into behaviours that seem completely irrational. While many of the details of the event have been lost to history, what remains is the image of people caught in a frenzied, uncontrollable dance, unable to stop and pushed by forces outside their control. But more than that, the aftermath of the plague reveals the deep-seated fear and anxiety that plagued not just Strasbourg, but all of Europe at the time. In the wake of the plague, Strasbourg's citizens had to come to terms with what had happened. How could something so bizarre have occurred? Why were certain people affected while others were not? And perhaps most importantly, how could they ensure that something like this would never happen again? For many, these questions were never fully answered. The mystery surrounding the event, combined with the fear of what might have caused it, left a lingering sense of unease that affected the cultural and social psyche of the time. Fast forward to the present day, and we see that many of these questions still echo in modern society. While we may no longer experience events as extreme as the dancing plague, we continue to grapple with the complexities of human behaviour under stress and the ways in which societies respond to crises. The rapid spread of misinformation, the rise of social media-driven mass hysteria, the outbreak of collective panic during times of uncertainty. These are all modern-day examples of the same psychological forces that influence the dances of Strasbourg. Despite all our advancements in understanding the human mind, we still see how easily mass fear and anxiety can manifest in irrational ways. One of the most fascinating aspects of the dancing plague is its exploration of the limits of knowledge. In the 16th century, the people of Strasbourg had no understanding of mental health, neurological disorders, or mass psychological phenomena. They couldn't fathom the idea of mass hysteria or collective delusion. Instead, they turned to the explanations they knew: religious interpretations, the idea of divine punishment, and other superstitions. But even today, we can see that our understanding of collective psychological events is still not complete. Though we have made strides in the fields of psychology and psychiatry, events like mass hysteria and collective breakdown still baffle us. The fact that such behaviours can emerge in response to fear, trauma, or societal pressure is a reminder of just how little we understand about the complexities of the human mind. As we continue to face global crises, whether it's economic instability, political unrest, or the ongoing challenges of a global pandemic, we must ask ourselves, what have we learned from the past, and how can we apply those lessons to the present? The dancing plague shows us that when societies are under extreme stress, collective behaviours can spiral out of control. We saw it in 1518, and we see it today in various forms. But the question remains, how can we prevent this from happening again? The answer lies in understanding the underlying forces that drive such behaviours. It's not just about managing physical health, it's about understanding the psychological toll that crises take on people and providing the necessary support to address those needs. In the 16th century, the authorities in Strasbourg were unable to understand the true nature of the problem, and their response, though rooted in the best knowledge they had at the time, only served to exacerbate the situation. In the modern world, we have the tools to do better. We must focus on creating a society that values mental health, fosters psychological resilience, and is prepared to address collective distress when it arises. As we look at the present, we also have to ask ourselves, are we truly prepared for the kinds of collective events that can cause mass panic or hysteria? We live in a time when information spreads rapidly, and when crises, whether personal or global, can trigger widespread reactions. From panic buying during economic uncertainty to mass movements fueled by social media, we see that the psychological mechanisms of mass behaviour are alive and well. The dancing plague serves as a cautionary tale, reminding us that societies under great stress can quickly become unmoored. But it's not just about fear or panic, it's also about the role of leadership and community. In Strasbourg, the authorities were ill-equipped to handle the crisis. They didn't have the psychological knowledge to address the mass hysteria, and their response failed to bring the situation under control. Today, we know that strong, compassionate leadership is essential in times of crisis. Leaders must be able to provide clarity, understanding, and reassurance in order to help communities weather difficult times. The dancing plague underscores the importance of having the right people in place who can guide society through moments of uncertainty and who can provide the support that individuals need to cope with stress and fear. As we move into the future, one of the most important lessons we can take from the dancing plague is the importance of resilience, not just at an individual level, but at a societal level. Societies must be equipped to handle crises in a way that goes beyond mere survival. It's not enough to simply weather the storm. We must learn how to rebuild, how to support each other, and how to prevent the psychological and emotional toll of trauma from becoming an all-consuming force. The dancing plague of 1518 was a tragedy, but it also left us with a valuable reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the importance of collective support in times of crisis. In the end, the legacy of the dancing plague is not just in the historical records, but in the lessons it offers for our own time. It's a stark reminder that human societies, though advanced, are still vulnerable to forces beyond our understanding. The human mind, when pushed to its limits, can behave in ways that are unpredictable, irrational, and sometimes destructive. And as we continue to face the challenges of the modern world, we must remember that the key to surviving crises is not just physical endurance, it's psychological resilience, social support, and compassionate leadership. The dancing plague of 1518 remains one of history's greatest mysteries, but its lessons are as relevant today as they were in the past. In times of crisis, we must learn from the past, understand the vulnerabilities of the human mind, and ensure that we are prepared for the psychological challenges that lie ahead. Only then can we hope to prevent history from repeating itself. As we draw near the conclusion of our journey through the dancing plague of 1518, it's worth taking one final moment to reflect on the profound impact this event continues to have on our understanding of human behaviour and societal resilience. The questions raised by the plague are not easily answered, and the answers we do have often lead to more questions. But perhaps that is the ultimate lesson, that human nature is complex, and sometimes we may never fully understand the events that shape our world. One thing that becomes increasingly clear as we reflect on this event is how much it highlights the intersection between individual and collective psychology. At the heart of the dancing plague was a psychological breakdown, a collective eruption of what we would today call mass hysteria. This phenomenon wasn't about individual mental illness, but rather about the shared trauma, fear, and stress that a community experienced. It was the result of external factors: war, disease, famine, that acted as a catalyst for psychological breakdown. In modern times, we are still susceptible to such pressures. Though we may have a deeper understanding of mental health and the human psyche, the psychological toll of living through crisis still affects entire communities. Today, we see the effects of collective distress in the modern world, albeit in different forms. The rapid spread of anxiety during financial crises, the panic during natural disasters, and the way social media can amplify fear and misinformation are all modern. Day reflections of the same psychological mechanisms that caused the dancing plague. Just as the people of Strasbourg were influenced by the stresses of their environment, so too are we influenced by the crises of our own time. Whether it's the constant onslaught of global news, the rise of economic inequality, or the ever-present threat of climate change, modern society is under immense pressure, and while we may not be dancing ourselves into exhaustion, we're still experiencing the psychological toll of living in a world that feels increasingly unstable. But unlike the people of Strasbourg, we have more resources available to us. We have the knowledge of mass psychological phenomena, we have mental health professionals, and we have the power of community support. We have the ability to understand and address the collective stresses that afflict us. The question, then, is not whether we are vulnerable to mass hysteria, but how we can prepare ourselves to cope with the stress that modern life brings. The lessons of the dancing plague urge us to consider not just the physical aspects of crises, but the emotional and psychological impacts as well. It's not enough to simply survive. We must also ensure that we are mentally and emotionally equipped to face the challenges ahead. As we reflect on this, we are reminded that leadership plays a crucial role in times of crisis. In Strasbourg, the authorities were ill-prepared for what was happening. Their response, an ill-conceived attempt to encourage the dancers to continue dancing, was both misguided and ineffective. But it's easy to be critical in hindsight. The reality is that the people of Strasbourg had no real understanding of mass psychological events like hysteria. In the absence of knowledge, their response was based on what they knew at the time, religion and superstition. Today, we know that a more rational and compassionate approach is necessary. Effective leadership in times of crisis requires an understanding of human behaviour, emotional support, and clear communication. It requires the ability to recognise when a society is under psychological stress and to take steps to mitigate that stress before it spirals out of control. The role of mental health in crisis response is one of the most important lessons we can take from the dancing plague. In modern societies, we must be more proactive in recognising the psychological toll of collective stress. Mental health care must be integrated into disaster planning, public health responses, and social support systems. And just as importantly, we must create communities where people feel empowered to seek help when they are struggling with their mental health. The stigma around mental illness must be eradicated, and open discussions about psychological well-being must become a normal part of everyday life. If we are to avoid a modern-day version of the dancing plague, we must ensure that mental health is prioritised, not just during moments of crisis, but every day. Another lasting legacy of the dancing plague is the way it shows us the power of cultural and societal context in shaping how we respond to stress and trauma. The people of Strasbourg were living in a time of great uncertainty. Disease, war, and famine were everyday realities. The constant fear of death, combined with the psychological burden of living in such a chaotic world, created a perfect storm for mass hysteria. In our own time, we face different pressures, but the psychological effects are no less real. We may not be dealing with the Black Death, but we are living through a period of unprecedented global crises. Climate change, economic instability, political divisions, and the ongoing impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. These stresses can affect us in profound ways, and like the people of Strasbourg, we may not fully understand how they manifest in our collective behaviour. As we look at the modern world, we see how mass hysteria can still emerge in response to widespread fear and uncertainty. From the irrational spread of conspiracy theories to the mass panic during economic downturns, we are not immune to the same psychological breakdowns that plagued the people of Strasbourg. The difference now is that we have a better understanding of how these behaviours develop. We know that collective stress can trigger irrational actions, and we have the tools to identify and address these issues before they spiral out of control. But the question remains, how prepared are we? How equipped are we to deal with the collective stress and fear that we are likely to face in the coming years? As we conclude our exploration of the dancing plague, we are left with more than just the fascination of a bizarre historical event. We are left with a reminder of the complexities of human behaviour and the deep, enduring impact of collective stress. The dancing plague is a story about the fragility of the human mind and the need for understanding, support and leadership in times of crisis. It's a story that calls us to reflect on how we, as a society, respond to fear and uncertainty, and how we can build a future where the psychological toll of living in a chaotic world is better understood and managed. In the end, the lessons of the dancing plague aren't just about history, they are about our own lives today, and the challenges we face as individuals and communities. As we move forward, let's remember the people of Strasbourg and the lessons they offer us. Let's ensure that we're building a society that is not just strong physically, but resilient mentally and emotionally. And perhaps most importantly, let's be aware of the psychological toll that crises take on us, and ensure that we are providing the support needed to weather the storms ahead. As we near the final leg of this exploration into the dancing plague of 1518, it's important to take one last step back and assess the long-term impact this event has had, not only on our understanding of mass psychological events, but also on the broader cultural memory. While it may seem like an isolated, incomprehensible episode from the distant past, the lessons from Strasbourg's ordeal continue to resonate in how we, as a society, navigate crises and psychological stress. The event itself, bizarre as it was, laid bare the intricacies of human behaviour under extreme conditions, and it continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the consequences of societal breakdowns. For the people of Strasbourg, the aftermath of the dancing plague was likely a period of deep reflection. It was a time when the town must have struggled to process what had happened, especially considering the lack of answers. Imagine living in a world where there was no clear distinction between medical and psychological causes, where the prevailing explanations were rooted in religion or superstition. For the individuals who had witnessed the frenzied dancing or even participated in it, the trauma must have left a lasting mark. However, due to the limited understanding of mental health at the time, it's unlikely that the town had the resources or frameworks to properly address this trauma. So, what can we learn from that? In many ways, the dancing plague offers insight into how societies, whether medieval or modern, cope with collective trauma. Just as the people of Strasbourg struggle to make sense of their strange experience, we too must navigate the aftermath of global crises, natural disasters, or social upheavals that leave deep emotional scars. The lesson is clear. Without proper understanding and intervention, the impact of collective trauma can be long-lasting. In modern society, while we may have more advanced resources and understanding, we still face challenges in addressing these psychological wounds. One of the most striking features of the dancing plague was the way it highlighted the power of collective behaviour. The idea of mass hysteria was not new in the context of human history. Societies have long been susceptible to irrational behaviour in times of stress. From the witch trials of Europe to the moral panics that gripped early American society, collective fear and hysteria have shaped human history. And yet, we continue to be fascinated by these phenomena, as if to remind ourselves that the human mind remains a mystery, even in an era of scientific advancement. In the modern world, we may not see people dancing uncontrollably in the streets as they did in Strasbourg, but we do see the power of collective behaviour in more subtle forms. We see it in the rise of social media trends, the spread of fake news, and the rapid contagion of panic during crises. The psychological mechanisms that drove the dancing plague are still very much at play today. Whether it's the way information spreads during a pandemic, or the way people panic buy products during a perceived shortage, the same forces that drove the dancers of Strasbourg are alive and well. This is a reminder that despite all our advances, we are still susceptible to the irrational behaviours that stem from our collective fears and anxieties. It's also worth noting that the dancing plague was not simply about the individual's breakdown, but about the breakdown of societal norms and structures. The authorities in Strasbourg, much like today's leaders in times of crisis, were caught off guard. They didn't know how to handle a mass psychological event, and their attempts to address it were based on limited knowledge. Today, we still see leaders struggling to deal with collective crises. Whether it's the global pandemic, political instability, or economic collapse, the challenges faced by governments and organisations in managing societal stress are strikingly similar to those faced by Strasbourg's officials. The key takeaway here is that effective leadership in times of crisis requires not just an understanding of the immediate physical or logistical needs, but also an understanding of the psychological and emotional toll that crises take on society. Leaders must be equipped with the tools to recognise when a community is under psychological distress and to provide support, clarity, and empathy. During the dancing plague, the authorities failed to understand the true nature of the crisis, and as a result, their response only fueled the panic. In the modern world, we must learn from this failure and prioritise mental health in crisis response plans. Leaders must be prepared to address the mental and emotional needs of a society, not just the physical ones. So what would it look like if we applied the lessons of the dancing plague to our world today? We live in a time when crises are no longer isolated. We face ongoing global challenges, from climate change to political polarisation, and the impact of these crises on the collective psyche can be profound. The question is, how do we ensure that we are building resilient communities, ones that can handle the psychological toll of living through uncertainty and crisis? The answer lies in creating supportive environments that foster mental and emotional resilience. This starts with building stronger communities, where people feel connected to each other and supported through difficult times. It involves providing access to mental health services, ensuring that people have the tools they need to cope with stress and trauma. It also requires leadership that prioritises emotional well-being, not just economic or physical recovery. When societies are under stress, the collective psyche must be cared for as much as the physical infrastructure, and that starts with recognising the long-term impact of crises on mental health and creating systems that can respond effectively. Furthermore, we need to continue to challenge the stigma surrounding mental health. Just as the people of Strasbourg in 1518 were unaware of the psychological forces at play, many people today still struggle to understand and address mental health issues. By normalising conversations about mental health, educating people on the signs of psychological distress, and providing resources for those who need help, we can begin to build a society that is more resilient to mass psychological events. The dancing plague, in many ways, is a metaphor for how we respond to collective trauma. It shows us that, when faced with overwhelming stress, societies can break down, both physically and psychologically, but it also shows us that, with the right tools and understanding, we can prevent such breakdowns from happening again. As we finish our exploration of the dancing plague, we're left with more than just a historical oddity. We have a powerful reminder of the complexities of human behaviour and the importance of understanding the psychological forces that shape our actions. The dancing plague wasn't just a strange event, it was a reflection of the human condition, and its lessons still ring true today. The dancing plague of 1518 was a time when a community lost its sense of control, but we can take the lessons learned from this event and apply them to our world today. It's up to us to ensure that, in times of crisis, we prioritise mental and emotional resilience. Only then can we hope to build a world where we don't just survive crises, but emerge from them stronger and more connected than ever before. As we now approach the conclusion of our exploration into the dancing plague of 1518, we can take a step back and reflect on the broader implications of this event, not just for the medieval world, but for our understanding of human behaviour, crisis management, and societal resilience. The story of the dancing plague is not merely about strange and uncontrollable dancing. It is a poignant reminder of the fragility of the human mind, especially when pushed to the limits by external stresses, fear, and trauma. It offers a unique opportunity to look at the past through a modern lens, understanding how these psychological dynamics still resonate in our world today. In thinking about the dancing plague, we must ask, what does it tell us about how societies deal with fear and the unknown? The people of Strasbourg were not simply victims of an unexplained phenomenon. They were living in a world that had already been ravaged by the Black Death, plagued by famine and fraught with political instability. In many ways, the event of 1518 was the culmination of the psychological and emotional strain that had built up over years. While we may never fully understand the specific cause of the dancing plague, it's clear that it was more than just a bizarre outbreak of involuntary dancing. It was a manifestation of collective fear, uncertainty, and trauma coming to a head in the form of mass hysteria. Today we live in a world that is not unlike that of medieval Europe. We may have different threats, but we're still living under immense stress and uncertainty. The challenges we face, climate change, economic instability, political upheaval, and the ongoing global health crises, create a level of stress that affects not just individuals, but entire societies. The question is, how can we learn from the past and build stronger, more resilient communities? The dancing plague teaches us that when communities are under extreme stress, psychological breakdowns can occur. This may manifest as mass hysteria, panic, or irrational behaviours. And while we may have more resources and knowledge today, we are still susceptible to the same psychological forces that influenced the people of Strasbourg in 1518. The dancing plague is not just a historical curiosity, it is a timeless reminder of the importance of understanding and managing collective stress. One of the most valuable lessons from the dancing plague is the importance of leadership in times of crisis. The authorities in Strasbourg were completely unprepared for what they faced. Their response, encouraging more dancing in an attempt to cure the dancers, was misguided and ineffective. But this failure wasn't just a result of ignorance. It was also a reflection of the cultural and societal norms of the time. The lack of understanding of psychological health and mass behaviour left the authorities with few tools to manage the crisis effectively. In today's world, we have a much greater understanding of mental health and psychological phenomena, but we still face challenges in responding to crises. Whether it's a natural disaster, a pandemic, or political instability, we often see leaders struggle to provide the kind of clarity and support that communities need during times of fear and uncertainty. The key takeaway from the dancing plague is that leadership must go beyond physical and logistical management. It must also address the emotional and psychological needs of a community. This means prioritising mental health support, providing clear communication, and fostering a sense of collective resilience. When societies face crises, it is essential that leaders not only manage the immediate practical issues, but also ensure that the psychological well-being of the community is taken into account. Another important lesson from the dancing plague is the need for mental health care in times of crisis. During the epidemic, the people of Strasbourg had no concept of mass hysteria or psychological trauma. They were completely unprepared to deal with the emotional and psychological effects of living through years of disease, famine, and social instability. Today, we have a much better understanding of the importance of mental health, but we still face significant gaps in mental health care, especially in times of crisis. Whether it's providing counselling after a natural disaster or offering support to those affected by a global pandemic, mental health services must be prioritised. Just as importantly, we must address the stigma surrounding mental health. The people of Strasbourg in 1518 may have turned to religion and superstition because they didn't have the language or understanding to discuss the psychological toll of their experiences. In modern society, we must ensure that people feel comfortable seeking help when they need it, and that mental health care is easily accessible to all. The lessons of the dancing plague urge us to create a society where mental health is treated with the same seriousness and urgency as physical health. Only then can we hope to build communities that are resilient to the stresses and challenges of the modern world. As we think about the future, the challenge is clear. The dancing plague reminds us that no matter how advanced we become, the human mind remains vulnerable to the forces of fear, stress, and uncertainty. But it also shows us that, With the right tools, understanding and support, we can build a more resilient society. We can create communities that are better equipped to handle collective trauma and societal breakdowns. We can prioritise mental health, provide resources for those in need, and ensure that, in times of crisis, we come together to support one another. The true power of the Dancing Plague lies in its ability to connect the past with the present. While the event itself may seem like a strange, isolated incident, it serves as a timeless reminder of the vulnerabilities that all societies face when under extreme stress. It challenges us to think about how we respond to crises, both as individuals and as communities, and to recognise the importance of psychological resilience in the face of adversity. As we close our exploration of this strange and unsettling chapter in history, we can take with us the lessons it offers. The Dancing Plague is not just a bizarre event, it is a reflection of the human condition. It shows us that we are all susceptible to the same stresses, fears and vulnerabilities. But it also reminds us that we have the power to build a more resilient world, one where mental health is prioritised, communities are supported and leaders are equipped to guide us through the storms that lie ahead. The Dancing Plague of 1518 may have ended, but the lessons it offers are as relevant today as they were 5 centuries ago. The true question is, how will we respond when faced with our own crises? Will we repeat the mistakes of the past, or will we use the knowledge we've gained to build a stronger, more resilient society? As we draw the final curtains on this profound journey through the Dancing Plague of 1518, it's hard not to marvel at the eerie resonance the event continues to have. For all its peculiarities, its madness, its mystery, this historic incident isn't just a strange chapter in Europe's past. It serves as a poignant reminder of the vulnerabilities of the human mind, the complexities of collective behaviour, and the unpredictable consequences of living in a world shaped by fear, uncertainty, and crisis. At the core of the Dancing Plague is one of the most fascinating aspects of human nature: the way societies respond to overwhelming stress. The event itself was not simply a product of a few individuals losing control, it was the manifestation of a broader social unravelling. Much like today, when we're faced with widespread fear, uncertainty and disaster, people in 1518 turned to what they knew in an attempt to make sense of it all. For the people of Strasbourg, that meant religion, superstition, and a desperate hope that they could control what was happening. In modern society, we are still influenced by similar forces: fear of the unknown, anxiety about the future, and societal pressures. Yet, while we may not witness spontaneous dance outbreaks, the psychological undercurrents of the Dancing Plague are still visible in our world. Whether it's the rapid spread of misinformation, collective panic during global crises, or the rise of conspiracy theories, we are still susceptible to the same collective breakdowns triggered by anxiety, fear, and social distress. We have better tools today to understand these phenomena: psychology, neuroscience, social media, but that doesn't mean we're immune to them. Perhaps one of the most important lessons we can take from the Dancing Plague is the way it challenges us to rethink our understanding of mental health, both individually and collectively. When we talk about mental health today, we often think of it in terms of the individual. We focus on personal therapy, medication, and self-care. But what the Dancing Plague teaches us is that mental health cannot be fully understood in isolation. It is influenced by the community, by the society in which we live. The collective trauma, stress, and fear of a community can manifest in ways that affect everyone, not just the individual. The lesson is clear. When communities are under stress, collective psychological phenomena can emerge. The individual is not isolated from the collective experience. That's why understanding mental health on a societal level is so important. We need to ask ourselves not only how we care for individuals who suffer from psychological distress, but also how we care for the communities that face collective distress. How do we build resilient communities? How do we support mental health on a broader scale to prevent breakdowns like the one we saw in Strasbourg? This, of course, takes us back to the role of leadership. the Dancing Plague shows us that leadership in times of crisis is about more than just managing physical resources or handling logistics. It's about understanding the collective psyche, providing reassurance, and fostering a sense of calm and cohesion. In Strasbourg, the authorities were completely unprepared to handle the psychological aspects of the crisis. Their response was inadequate and in many ways exacerbated the situation. The lack of understanding of mass hysteria and collective stress left them unable to act in a way that could address the deeper psychological needs of the community. In modern times, we must not make the same mistake. When crises occur, whether they are natural disasters, economic downturns, or social upheavals, leaders must have an understanding of the emotional and psychological needs of their communities. It's not enough to simply focus on the physical aspects of the crisis. People need emotional support, they need to feel heard, and they need to know that there is a plan in place to address the mental health challenges that arise during difficult times. Effective crisis leadership is not just about responding to the immediate needs. It's about recognizing the long-term psychological impact of living through a crisis and ensuring that resources are available to help people heal. We also need to recognize the importance of mental health education and resources in building resilient communities. After all, the people of Strasbourg did not have the resources we have today to understand and address the psychological forces at play. They lacked a language for describing what was happening, and the societal understanding of mental health was virtually non-existent. In our modern world, we have a unique opportunity to address these issues before they spiral out of control. By fostering mental health awareness, providing resources for communities to understand collective stress, and normalizing conversations about psychological well-being, we can begin to create communities that are more resilient to the psychological challenges that inevitably arise in times of crisis. But this doesn't just apply to global crises, it applies to our everyday lives as well. If the Dancing Plague shows us anything, it's that the human mind is fragile, and that society's collective mental health is just as important as individual well-being. We cannot afford to ignore the psychological toll of living in an increasingly uncertain and stressful world. If we are to build a future that is truly resilient, we must take care of our collective mind. We must ensure that communities are not just physically healthy, but mentally and emotionally healthy as well. As we look to the future, we must acknowledge the lessons from the past. The Dancing Plague, with all its bizarre and unsettling details, is not just a historical curiosity. It is a reflection of the human condition. A reminder that we are deeply vulnerable to the psychological forces of fear, stress, and trauma. The event of 1518 challenges us to think about how we, as individuals and as a society, respond to fear, uncertainty, and trauma. It challenges us to build a world where mental health is not only a priority during crises, but as part of our everyday lives. And it reminds us that, no matter how advanced we become, we will always face moments when the collective psyche is pushed to its limits. The final takeaway from the Dancing Plague is this: we are all connected in our experiences of stress, trauma, and fear. Just as the people of Strasbourg were bound by their shared crisis, so too are we. The question is not whether crises will come, but how we will respond when they do. If we remember the lessons of the Dancing Plague, we will be better equipped to handle the psychological challenges of the future, together as a resilient, compassionate society. So, as we end our exploration of the Dancing Plague, we leave with a powerful reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the necessity of understanding the collective psyche in times of stress. We can take solace in the fact that, with the right tools, knowledge, and compassion, we can face the challenges ahead and build a future where both individual and collective well-being are prioritized. This is the legacy of the Dancing Plague, a reminder that understanding, support, and resilience are our best defenses in a world that can sometimes feel like it's spinning out of control. As we come to the final section of this exploration into the Dancing Plague of 1518, we reflect on the lasting impact of this strange and perplexing event. More than just a bizarre historical occurrence, the Dancing Plague offers us insight into the human condition. particularly how people and societies react to overwhelming stress and fear. It is a stark reminder that, for all our advancements, there are still forces at play within the human psyche that we do not fully understand. The Dancing Plague shows us that when societies are under extreme duress, strange behaviours can emerge, and often these behaviours are shaped by the collective emotional and psychological environment. What stands out most about the Dancing Plague is the role of mass hysteria, an idea that still captures the imagination of historians and psychologists alike. The concept of mass hysteria, the collective breakdown of rational thought in the face of fear, anxiety or trauma, is one that has been observed throughout history. While the Dancing Plague may have been an extreme case, it is not unique in how it shows the fragility of the human mind under stress. From political upheavals to social movements, we continue to see the same psychological forces at play today. This makes the Dancing Plague an important part of understanding human behaviour, even in the 21st century. But the Dancing Plague is not just a story of psychological breakdown, it is also a story of human resilience and the challenges that societies face when trying to cope with collective trauma. The people of Strasbourg, despite their confusion and fear, managed to come together in the face of something completely inexplicable. The town endured through one of the most bizarre and unsettling episodes in European history. And like all societies that face similar crises, they emerged, though forever marked by what they had endured. However, the lesson we must take from the plague is that while people can come together in times of crisis, they must be given the tools to understand and manage the psychological and emotional toll of those crises. When a society is caught in the grip of collective trauma, the immediate focus is often on survival, physical recovery, or restoring order. But what about the invisible wounds? The psychological ones? These wounds, though less visible, can have long-lasting effects on individuals and communities. It is imperative that, in modern times, we focus not only on physical recovery after a crisis, but also on healing the collective mind. As we look at the world today, we can see the echoes of the Dancing Plague in how we respond to modern crises. When faced with social or political upheaval, economic instability, or global challenges like pandemics or climate change, we see the same psychological breakdowns emerge in different forms. It may not be a dance that takes hold of a community, but we do witness collective panics, social media frenzies, and the rapid spread of misinformation. People are still susceptible to irrational behaviour when faced with fear, uncertainty, and the unknown. The Dancing Plague was just one example of how collective trauma can manifest, and it serves as a timely reminder that even in our modern world, the forces of collective fear, stress, and anxiety are just as powerful today as they were in 1518. What's most striking is how little our responses have evolved. Though we may have access to more advanced knowledge of psychology and behaviour, we still struggle to respond to mass hysteria and collective panic in meaningful ways. Just as the authorities in Strasbourg were overwhelmed and lacked the understanding to manage the event, modern leaders sometimes fall short in managing the psychological consequences of crises. A true crisis response, after all, is not just about physical recovery, logistics, and the practicalities of rebuilding. It's about understanding how the collective mind is affected by the trauma and addressing the emotional needs of society. When crises hit today, we often see a similar kind of breakdown: panic buying, irrational behaviour, and even the rise of conspiracy theories and social movements based on fear and uncertainty. But how can we break this cycle? How can we respond to societal distress in a way that helps us heal collectively, rather than fall deeper into fear and panic? The answer lies in education, awareness, and leadership. It means providing communities with the tools to cope with stress, fostering emotional and mental resilience, and normalizing conversations around mental health. It's about creating communities that are not only physically strong, but mentally and emotionally equipped to deal with challenges, no matter how overwhelming they may be. One of the lasting legacies of the Dancing Plague is its reminder that the human mind is still an enigma. Despite all our advancements in medicine and science, we still don't fully understand how and why mass psychological events occur. This is why the Dancing Plague continues to captivate historians, psychologists and researchers alike. It's not just the event itself that interests us, it's the window it provides into the ways that fear, trauma, and collective anxiety can shape human behaviour. It's a mystery that remains as relevant today as it was 500 years ago. But as much as the event serves as a reminder of human fragility, it also offers hope. It tells us that despite the unpredictability of human behaviour, we have the ability to understand and manage collective stress. The dancing plague may have been an extreme case, but it shows us the importance of recognising the psychological and emotional toll that crises take on communities. It's a call to action to build societies that are resilient to fear, trauma, and stress. A society that supports its members, addresses mental health needs, and fosters a sense of collective healing. In closing, the story of the dancing plague of 1518 may seem far removed from the modern world, but its lessons are universal. It's a story about the fragility of the human mind, the power of collective behaviour, and the importance of leadership and community in times of crisis. It challenges us to think about how we respond to fear, how we support each other during stressful times, and how we build resilient societies that are equipped to handle the psychological challenges of the modern world. The event itself may have ended long ago, but the lessons it provides are timeless. Whether it's the fear and uncertainty we face today, or the collective distress that marked the people of Strasbourg, the human response to crisis remains much the same. And in that response, we find both the vulnerabilities and the strength that define us as human beings. The dancing plague may be a strange chapter in history, but its story is one that will continue to echo through time, reminding us of the complexities of the human mind and the importance of understanding and supporting each other through the trials of life. Sweet dreams.